Thank you so much for joining us and good afternoon. This is our third webinar in our new webinar series, and I want to introduce myself, our organization, and my colleague, Clarybel Peguero. My name is Sarah Segura, and I'm the Administrative and Client Services Specialist with DeEtta Jones Associates. And Clarybel, if I can get you to advance one slide. Perfect. So we're a consulting firm. Here's a picture of all of us. And you can see here that it's the team of us here. We're able to provide services to individuals and organizations to help you do your best work as far as being a leader from anywhere you are in the organization, and as far as managing yourself or resources, teams, and departments. We're here to equip you with the skills to be as effective as possible in your individual and organizational endeavors. We also do quite a lot of work working with organizations at the leadership level in order to think about aspects such as organizational transformation, having a positive impact on organizational culture, or really thinking about some of the processes and experiences that go along with effectively navigating change management. Those are a few things about DeEtta Jones Associates. We're virtually located all over the United States and Canada, and we come in from different places and have a variety of different strengths and different experiences that we're really excited to share with you. This webinar series is really an opportunity for us to be able to highlight some of the topics that people ask us about most often, and to also share some of the expertise associated with the amazing team that we call the DJA Team. Today, we'll be hearing from one of our amazing team members, Clarybel. Clarybel is a DJA consultant and is the Senior Director for Volunteer Engagement at the Duke Alumni Association. Clarybel's expertise lies in areas such as organizational development and change management, individual coaching and team building, as well as implementation of data-driven initiatives. We're really excited to have Clarybel working with us today. Most importantly, though, we want to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts or your ideas for future webinars on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much for joining us today, and take it away, Clarybel.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. And I am really excited to be here with you guys this afternoon. It's 1 o'clock on the East Coast. So thank you all for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedule. We were really excited to see the number of folks that registered for the webinar. And we recognize that it is a topic that people want to discuss. So we intentionally entitled it Navigating the Complexity, because we also recognize that it is a complex topic. We provided you a handout so that you can kind of take some notes along the way during the discussion. And then there will be some questions that I will directly ask you so that we can have a little bit more of an engaging process. I know that webinars are a little difficult to do that. Sarah will serve as our Vanna White in the back and collecting the questions and the comments. So she'll be able to kind of chime in when people have questions for me or would like to make a comment for the rest of the group. All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started and talk about microaggressions. Unfortunately, unintentionally, we may be creating environments for individuals that are not inclusive or representative of the diverse community that we live in. So in this session, I'm hoping that you'll be able to learn more about this emotionally charged and culturally nuanced topic, get a better understanding of what microaggressions are, and how you can reframe your own language and speech. So let's go ahead and get started. If you look at the handout, one of the first questions that I ask is, why is microaggressions an important topic to discuss? And sometimes people have a hard time even just defining microaggressions. So we know that oftentimes microaggressions are committed by well-intentioned, good people, not meaning to hurt anyone. Unfortunately, I too have made some deeply offensive remarks over my lifetime that were unintentionally hurtful. And the fact remains that it is inappropriate and it's highly offensive to those that are on the receiving end of getting those microaggressions. So it's important that we really do exercise a level of awareness when interacting with people that have experiences that are different than ours. So let's talk a little bit about the effects and the impact that microaggressions have. And that's why it's such an important topic to discuss. But it's critical to understand that when somebody is experiencing microaggressions, that they could have these feelings of alienation that can lead to feelings of not belonging. They can encounter imposter syndrome, which, as you know, it's when an individual starts doubting their own accomplishments and have internalized fear of being seen as a fraud. Sometimes people experience stereotype threats, which is really defined as someone being afraid of representing the stereotypes that are associated with their identity. Some people experience diminished confidence, forms of anxiety and depression. And so when we talk about why this topic is important, it's because of all of those things that people are experiencing. So if you'll take a second and on your handout, write out a few things that you think people experience because of experiencing microaggressions. What are some of the effects and impact that you perhaps have seen throughout? And like I said, Sarah will chime in with some comments as well as some of the questions as we continue to go along. So,
I think people are looking for the handout.
okay.
And, I'll try and track that down and send it out in just a minute.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. So let's go ahead and define microaggressions. So we know that it's a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. So we know that they are often brief instances that occur for a lot of people on a daily basis, which really bring about these negative viewpoints, and they're really communicated in a hostile way. There are two types of microaggressions. There's micro assaults and micro invalidations. Micro assaults are what is considered like old fashioned racism, things that are uncommon but deliberate, conscious, and explicit. So, an example would be that unfortunately today we have people of color that are still experiencing not being served at restaurants. We know that there was a highly publicized Supreme Court case recently in Colorado with a baker that refused to make a custom wedding cake for a same sex couple. These are examples of deliberate, conscious microassaults. Microinvalidations are defined as when you negate or nullify individual thoughts or feelings and really not being aware. An example of that is just not being aware of cultural differences. Sometimes those are manifested by people asking inappropriate questions. I have a very wavy hair texture, and I often get asked, how often do you wash your hair? And or I get asked, can I touch your hair? And unfortunately, that is not something that I should be asked every day, but it does happen. And it's something making me feel that I'm culturally different than what the norm is, or that my hair texture is different. So, what happens when people experience these microaggressions is that you go through an internal dilemma. You start really thinking about three things, and that is, did I interpret what happened to me correctly? Should I say something about what happened to me? And how do I say it? And most importantly, am I overreacting? So sometimes those are the questions that we really think about is, was that something that happened to me? Did I interpret that correctly? Should I say something? And most importantly, who do I say it to? And then am I overreacting? So my question to you guys is, what type of microaggressions have you experienced? And truthfully, what are some microaggressions that maybe you have unintentionally committed? And we're going to let Sarah look at some of the questions that are being posted or comments.
You can either open your microphone and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat box.
All right. So just as we get those comments or questions, I'll kind of share a little bit of what some of the common microaggressions that people often share. So, oh, good. I hear somebody.
We have one question saying, as an African immigrant, I've often been asked where I learned English. I constantly have to educate that I'm from Kenya, where English is a native language. And then another microaggression that's shared is, did you cut your hair? Somebody also said, you don't look like a librarian. Another example is asking an Asian student, where are you from? And then someone also says, I'm in a same-sex relationship. People often ask me, which one of you is the woman? And then someone also says, microaggressions to me, touching my hair, calling me a token to my face. You're so articulate. What was it like growing up in the hood? And then finally, another person weighs in with a quote, how did you get so interested in reading? So all of these, I think, are examples for us to kind of consider and discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for sharing those. Those are absolutely what we are discussing today. And so one of you shared the common one about you're so articulate. So we know that people commenting on people's speaking or language abilities is a problem. The woman from Kenya that mentioned when people are asking, where did you learn English? So instead, it's important that these comments are not made, that you actually can share with someone, you know, I really enjoyed your idea or your insight, but not talk about how somebody is speaking.
Sorry to interrupt. I think also very interesting is that somebody's also shared some microaggressions that they committed.
Okay.
Realize that I often say, quote, that's lame, or quote, that's crazy. And I'm trying to be cognizant of not saying those. As an LGBT person, I don't like when people say, quote, that's so gay. So I shouldn't say similar things that are microaggressions to people with disabilities or mental illness.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And that's what we call self-reflection and being able to really look at what we are doing. And sometimes because we identify as a part of marginalized groups, we often feel that we should be the ones most cognizant of it. But unfortunately, we are the ones that are committing them as well. So thank you so much for your honesty about that and recognizing the work that you're doing to be better in that area. So as we continue to move along with some of those common microaggressions, you know, one that I really struck me was the way you have overcome your disability is so inspiring. So often we forget that individuals with disabilities have to deal with microaggressions. You should not be shocked when a colleague or a friend is able to accomplish as much as someone that's able-bodied. So we recommend that instead of focusing on that you really focus on the person in all of themselves and not just their disability, so that you aren't telling them we're so proud of what you have accomplished. Somebody mentioned being LGBT. One thing that we hear about is, oh, you're gay, you should meet my friend, they're gay too. You know, we know that just because two people have one thing in common does not mean that they'll be a great match. And so in that instance, it's important that we say nothing. And that if somebody discloses their sexual orientation to us, unless they have asked us to meet someone, that we should not be just trying to introduce them to someone based on that. We deal with a lot of microaggressions when it comes to ageism, and we're finding that technology has really created that gap. And so asking someone that you perceive to not understand technology today, do you even know what Snapchat is? Did you even have a computer, growing up? All of those age discrimination issues is something that are some of our folks are experiencing. And though they seem like very innocent comments, for some of our seasoned professionals and older staff members, that can really feel alienating, and sometimes even make them feel like they're out of some of the social circles within our offices. So we have to make sure that we are intentional and inclusive when we're talking about those things. My favorite, and the one that I deal with the most myself, is know, where are you really from? I get asked that, I can honestly say, once a day at a minimum, but every day. And I receive that question because of how I look. And so what it does and how it makes me feel is that people will assume that Americans look a certain way. And so when they're asking me, know where you're really from, is they want to know what my background is, where are my parents from, where are my grandparents from. And so that really does.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think as you're in that vein, it's also interesting. Somebody else made the comment, when I had African-American male partners in the past 3 decades, without knowing this info, Southern people, usually white males, have made disparaging and or aggressive comments about African-Americans. But then I think going to the where are you really from, this person also says, my kids are multiracial, and they have told me that people have rudely asked them, what are you? So that's the last piece of this. Sorry.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Tina. And thank you for those that made those comments. And that is another piece of microaggressions, is that somebody can be saying something about someone that you know or that you're with, and not have no idea of your relationship with someone. And when it comes to the person that mentioned having multiracial children, is that we have to be very careful in not being implicitly biased towards someone that doesn't look a certain way. And people need to be able to share their identity at their own discretion, and should be allowed to identify the way that they would like to identify. And we're seeing that a lot on college campuses with our multiracial students that don't want to be put into one category or one box. But for our purposes, we want to see them. And so we're like, well, no, really, which one do you identify with? That's so important to us. But that should not be the case. And that really does cause people to have anxiety towards their own identity. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we are going to move forward and talk a little bit about how do we avoid microaggressions. So one thing that one of our persons, one of our people that's on the webinar already mentioned, so I really appreciate it, is how do you become more self-reflective? And so I look at it as a 3-step process when you're trying to be a little bit more self-reflective. Is really think about the experience, really think about the conversation that you had, what were your thoughts, and how did it make you feel? So when I engage in self-reflection, I really want to look at the totality of the experience, but most importantly, what I was thinking throughout and how it made me feel, and then figure out what is the best way to address a microaggression that has been done towards me, or perhaps something that I have unintentionally done towards someone else. It's so important that you participate in continuing education. Just like the person mentioned, that sometimes because we are part of a marginalized group, we feel that we know everything and that we aren't the people that are participating in this behavior, but sometimes we are the worst offenders. And so we have to be very, very careful. So doing these type of webinars and expanding your knowledge and understanding is so important. We have to continue to avoid making assumptions and labeling others. It's so important that you recognize when you're doing that, and start asking yourself questions about what assumptions are you making and why you're making those assumptions. because that really leads into our unconscious bias. And we know that unconscious bias is something that happens so quickly. It's automatic. Our brains immediately just go to that. And so we have to be intentional in fighting those thoughts and really trying to figure out what makes the most sense and how to move forward, because it definitely has a negative impact on others. So I want to refer back to the handout and ask another follow-up question is, when you've experienced microaggressions or perhaps unintentionally committed them, what type of support have you offered someone or have you experienced?
We can just pause for a second here if you all want to chime in.
And I'll go ahead and share for myself is when I've experienced microaggressions, I make sure that I have a group of people that I can talk to so that I can walk through the three phrases that I mentioned earlier is, did I hear that correctly? I'll repeat what the person said to me and I'll ask them, did I hear that correctly? Should I say something? And am I overreacting? And so that's what I've done. I try to seek support from people that don't look like me or don't have the same identity, lived experience, because that also does help when it comes to reflecting, because there might be something that I did not see from that experience and that lens that they're able to share with me and help shape that. So,
Clarybel, two people weigh in.
okay.
So, deals with, I think, in a similar way as you. She says, or the person says, I have a group of friends that I can go to and talk about it. And then another person weighs in, again, as a, in parentheses, new African immigrant. I have had to step in the gap and advocate for African American people who microaggressions are directed towards in their presence or not. And then I have interrupted, another person says, I've interrupted and corrected folks for incorrect pronoun use. So
that is wonderful ways of being an ally during this time. And when you do that, you really become the voice of the voiceless. So I really appreciate that person that's saying that they immediately interrupt and say, wait, let's talk about this. And for those that experience microaggressions, when we see that allyship, it really creates a level of trust. And the more we see it, the more consistent people are doing that and holding others accountable. That really does help the experience that we're dealing with. So thank you so much for sharing that.
I think an additional person says, it is difficult to find support for ageist comments. So I try to use humor, but it still hurts.
Absolutely. And we know that right now we have an intergenerational workforce, and we are dealing, right now they say there's about 6 generations that are living. And there are 3 currently in the workforce and 1 that is about to join the workforce. And so we have to be very, very, very mindful of what we say and how we say it and the effect, and making those assumptions that someone doesn't know about technology because of their age range, or that somebody knows a lot about technology because of where they're at, or has a different work style. Unfortunately, millennials sometimes get stereotyped in one category. And so making sure that we don't put a brush on all millennials that work for you or that you're around, or baby boomers or any one of the generations, because they all have wonderful skills. And it's a broad brush that we paint when we do that. So thank you so much for sharing that. Anything else, Sarah, that's come up?
I think just one additional comment saying, I've shared microaggression occurrence with a supportive friend.
Absolutely. So important. And so we also have to understand like what mechanisms are in place when it comes to our workplace, as far as being able to report or share those things. So make sure that you are aware of who you should talk to and then what you would like the outcome to be. So Sometimes receiving an apology from the person is enough. Having a mediated discussion with someone is what you.
Clarybel, I'm sorry. One other person has chimed in with, in the case of my African-American boyfriend, we went to counseling together to deal with the universe of issues arising from microaggressions and overall discrimination. Quote, not, or in parentheses, not just race, but culture and ageism also. In parentheses, I also participated in an international skills program to better understand the views of other people.
Excellent. So you're trying to create a level of empathy. So because we're not going to live in everybody's shoes, we're not going to understand everyone's situation and to be able to see the world through their lens. But when we create that level of empathy and understanding and seeking understanding, that really does help us be better people. So I thank you so much for sharing about counseling and attending events and trying to learn more of understanding people's perspectives. So we want to make sure that we stay committed to creating an environment that really does combat microaggressions in the future. So I really want to challenge us all to be committed to that, to create that more inclusive environment, and to be intentional and reflective and ready. I loved, like I said, the person that said, I immediately stopped the conversation and addressed something that they don't feel comfortable that's happening or being said. And so we all have to be that person and not to participate in those type of situations. So with the challenge, I wanted to ask you, what can you commit to combat microaggressions in the future? And I'll allow Sarah to collect some of those in the chat box.
And somebody mentioned that it's a bit jarring for them that I keep on interrupting the speaker, and I'm so sorry. I'm just trying to add all of your input in. So I'm sorry to step on you, Clarybel. But hopefully, please don't hesitate to offer your input. That's what this forum is for.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. As you know, when you're doing webinars, it's hard for the speaker to also be looking at the question and chat box. So we thought this would be the best way to do it, and we are in different locations. But thank you for letting us know that. So what do you commit to?
I think, Clarybel, one person had said, it was kind of at the tail end of the comments, citing that it's hard to gauge what is overreacting when we were talking about dealing with microaggressions. And does that factor in at all to the discussion on how to commit to combating microaggressions in the future?
That is a wonderful question, because it is a slippery slope. As we do create allies, sometimes some of our allies are a little more sensitive to some things because they want to make sure that they are combating these issues. And so overreaction, I think for me, is you can never truly overreact if you keep your composure, if you are speaking in a tone that is not offensive to anyone, if you've tried to isolate the person and ask them to come into a space so that you two can talk by yourself. I think if you create a comfortable environment to have the discussion, then I don't believe you're overreacting, because that's so important to not get the person to be defensive and to focus on your character versus the behavior that they're exhibiting. So that's so important, to just create the space where you can really have the conversation that's as comfortable as possible, so that you're addressing the real concern and not somebody's tone or some other factors that play into that.
Clarybel, some people are weighing in. So someone said, I can commit to tactfully letting the person who commits the microaggression how their comment has been received. Another person says, one way I commit to combating microaggressions in the future is to continue to learn about cultural differences. Another person says, I address with the person privately. I feel conflicted about it because usually the microaggression happens publicly. And then I will commit to continuing to speak out and use the social and cultural capital that has been, quote, given to me. I will make sure to explain to people how we must separate the idea of impact versus intent. It's important for people to understand that even if their intention is not to harm, it matters more the level of impact their words or actions have on another person. Someone else says, I can commit to having let's talk at lunch conversations that are proactively addressing issues. Somebody says, white infragility says blacks let microaggressions slide. Someone says, I commit to sharing the impact. Some people are not always aware of the impact of their words or biases. I can say things like, quote, you may not realize this, but, or quote, it was likely not your intent, but, and someone said, I'd like to ask if folks are open to feedback. And finally, someone says, as a Black person, I will try to recognize and speak out.
These are wonderful. And, I think that you have to find your voice in order to combat this and not to be someone else. I'm someone that is always high energy and very smiley, and so I try to stay myself even during those circumstances. So when I call in a colleague and say, like someone said, let's talk, they know that that I'm being serious, that I would like to address something. So I kind of change my tone so they know that something has affected me, but I still stay true to who I am, and we can have that discussion. But you have to find your voice in the way that you would like to address it with people. So I love the one that said, can I give you some feedback? Have you thought about how this can affect someone? And there's something very, very, very powerful when the person that you're addressing actually looks like you, because that means that they can receive it even better, because they're saying, okay, if you could see this, I have to figure out how I can see this as well. And so I think that there is some power in that. So being able to use that. Sarah, are there any more comments?
Not that I'm seeing, but please feel free to chime in.
All right, so we are open to any more questions that you may have about the reading that you did prior to this, on did you really just say that, or how microaggressions can affect well-being in the workplace. There's a lot of research that says that this has such an effect on workplace culture, and that for some it could truly be toxic. And so I think making sure that we continue to engage in these conversations and being intentional is so important. Well, hearing no other questions or any other comments, I'll let Sarah go ahead and take it away.
We thank you all so much for sharing during this webinar. The webinar has been recorded, and we will be posting it on our YouTube page in the next day or two. And please share it with whomever you'd like. And also go ahead, comment, let us know how you think about this, or add any additional ideas to the webinar on our YouTube page. And we'll see you next month. Oh, here's a question.
Oh, okay.
From your experience, Clarybel, is it best to address microaggressions privately after a meeting or during a meeting?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that after the meeting is the best time, unless you find that it has completely changed the mood, the space, the the air, I often say that the air can just get so hot and people just so uncomfortable that it needs to be addressed at that time. But if you find that the conversation continued, then pulling that colleague aside and maybe even saying to the colleague as you're walking out, hey, can I speak to you or can we chat? Can I give you some feedback? So that way the person that maybe experienced the microaggression sees that there is some follow-up. And I know that that's something that they would really appreciate, to know that somebody has had their back during such a difficult experience, because they still might be in that internal dilemma and their conflict. And other people around the room might be as well. They might be struggling with, would it be an overreaction if I just interrupted the meeting and said something? Should I wait? Who do I tell? So they might be going through the steps as well. So figuring out, is it comfortable enough to address it right then? Or should you just wait till after the meeting? I have found that after the meeting has worked best, because the person could receive it a little better. But you also have to be aware of if it has affected the person and visibly affected, or has really changed the mood of the meeting, so that it's addressed immediately.
Somebody has asked, your thoughts on interrupting as an ally, but possibly speaking over the person impacted.
So,
and then, sorry, someone else has said, I like to check in with the affected person first to see if they need help. So that's one viewpoint.
So that is a great viewpoint, is to check in on the person, because like we've talked about, sometimes somebody could have microaggression fatigue. They've experienced so many microaggressions in their lifetime that maybe they're not even aware that day that has happened to them. So then you go in and go talk to someone, and then the person checks in and they say, well, no, I didn't think that was a big deal. So you're right, it is a slippery slope. But I think sometimes we have to use our own internal mechanism to say, I didn't like what just happened. I am going to address it for myself. And that's what I'm going to do in order to move forward with this day and to feel comfortable about working with this person. I need to do it for myself. So sometimes knowing that the intended affected person might not be affected because of whatever that they have self-protection or what they have created in their world in order to exist and coexist. But for you yourself, if you're like, I'm not comfortable, this didn't sit well for me, so that is why I'm going to address it. And I often find that when supportive colleagues come up and say, hey, are you okay? How did that make you feel? That sometimes in the workplace, the person isn't as honest and really says anything, because maybe they've experienced it before, or just are not at that place, or maybe not comfortable with you as a colleague. So I think for me, that the gauge, the barometer is really internal, and it's how I felt about the interaction, how I felt about what was said, and that's what I would like to go and address. But thank you so much. If there's any other strategies that people would like to post and share, we definitely would love to receive them. All right. Sarah, are you still there?
Yeah. Absolutely. And somebody has said, I really appreciate you pointing out that not everybody we think should be offended is.
Yes. Thank you. And it really, when you've experienced your life where, that something is always being asked of you or said to you, that sometimes you just have created some boundaries and some self-protection. And so you might not be offended anymore by something. But like I said, I think that we have to use our own internal barometer and say, okay, I didn't like how this felt, and so I'm going to address it accordingly.
Someone said, I also like pointing out that we need to think about how it affects us. We all need to be affected by microaggressions, not just doing it on behalf of somebody else or someone else.
Excellent comment. Excellent comment about reflection. And just like you said, we're all in this space together. What you said in a meeting did affect the mood and the person and our environment. And so we are all going to say something. And, you know, remember that it's not an attack on anybody's character, it's just behavior, and that it's unintentionally committed. You know, I don't think anyone intentionally decides to say, this is what we're going to do. People are not having micro assaults every day. They're not committing micro assaults on a daily basis. That's not, usually it's microaggressions. It's done unconsciously, you know, unintentionally by good people. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for your time. We look forward to any questions that you may have. Please feel free to send our way. Like Sarah mentioned, it has been recorded, so you can share with anyone. Also, the worksheet, it might be something that you might want to give out to folks and have a good discussion in your office, because I think that sometimes just having the dialogue is so important. And we commend you for your willingness to continue your education and to have the conversations despite how difficult they might be. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.